In the spring of 2019, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Oxford organized a series of lectures on science, faith, and contemporary society. The event aimed to promote profound dialogues between different worldviews, away from the media sensationalism that typically accompanies these topics. For the main debate, the Institute's director, Dr. James Wilson, had a bold idea: to invite Richard Dawkins, renowned evolutionary biologist and declared atheist, and Father Timothy Radcliffe, respected Dominican theologian and former master of the Dominican order. "It will be a fascinating intellectual encounter," Wilson commented to his team. On one side, Dawkins, one of the most eloquent advocates of scientific atheism. On the other, Father Radcliffe, one of the most profound Catholic thinkers of our time. Several assistants expressed doubts. Dawkins will hardly accept a discussion that doesn't give him significant media exposure, one pondered. And even if he did accept, Father Radcliffe might decline, considering Dawkins's history of public attacks on religion. Surprisingly, both accepted the invitation. Dawkins was enthusiastic about the prospect of confronting a representative of religious superstition in an academic setting. Father Radcliffe, in turn, saw an opportunity for genuine dialogue on fundamental questions. In the week prior to the debate, Dawkins meticulously prepared his arguments, focusing on biblical contradictions, theological inconsistencies, and scientific evidence against supernatural beliefs. "I'll dismantle him with logic and facts," he commented to a colleague. "These religious types are never prepared for a truly rational debate." Father Radcliffe adopted a different approach. He devoted himself to prayer and review of Dawkins's works, including The God Delusion and other texts critical of religion. "It's not about winning a debate," he explained to a concerned fellow friar. "It's about establishing honest dialogue, even across our deepest differences." The auditorium, with capacity for 200 people, was completely full. In the front row sat academics from various fields. The rest of the room was filled with students, professors, and those interested in the topic, many attracted by Dawkins' fame, others by Father Radcliffe's reputation. The lights dimmed slightly as the moderator, a professor of philosophy of science at Oxford, took the stage. After a brief introduction about the importance of dialogue between science and religion, he announced that Richard Dawkins would speak first, as agreed. Dawkins adjusted the microphone, observed the audience for a few moments, and began in a deliberately provocative tone. "The fundamental question we should be asking is not whether God exists, but why in the 21st century educated people still believe in supernatural fairy tales." This acerbic opening generated mixed reactions, restrained laughter from some, uncomfortable glances from others. Father Radcliffe remained serene, carefully observing his opponent. "We're here today to discuss science and faith, but there's a fundamental problem. Science is based on evidence, whilst religious faith requires the suspension of rationality," Dawkins continued. "How can we compare a knowledge system that continuously corrects itself with dogmas fixed centuries ago?" In the following minutes, he presented arguments against theism, the problem of evil, biblical contradictions, evolution as a sufficient explanation for biological complexity. His speech, although articulate, contained increasing provocations. Religion is fundamentally a form of magical thinking that has survived our scientific understanding of the world. It is a mental virus that infects young minds before they can develop critical defenses. Occasionally, he cast direct glances at Father Radcliffe, clearly expecting signs of irritation or discomfort. To his frustration, in our age of polarization, we often confuse aggressiveness with depth and volume with truth. Authentic intellectual exchange requires something more difficult: the capacity to genuinely listen to the other, even when we profoundly disagree. Without altering his serene tone, Father Radcliffe began to respond methodically to the accusations, not with religious dogmas, but with carefully articulated philosophical arguments. "The errors and crimes committed by members of the Church throughout history are indefensible and cause profound shame to all conscious Catholics. It would be dishonest to deny this painful reality, but it would be equally reductionist to define an intellectual and spiritual tradition of 2 millennia solely by its worst moments and representatives." The Dominican then addressed the question of the rationality of faith. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in characterizing religious faith as believing without evidence or suspension of rationality. The Catholic tradition, from Augustine to Thomas Aquinas, has always understood faith as intellectus quaerens fidem, intelligence seeking to understand faith. With impressive erudition, the theologians cited contemporary philosophers on the epistemological limits of scientific naturalism, including some that Dawkins himself had mentioned in his books, but with different interpretations. When the time came for direct questions, Dawkins, visibly disconcerted by Father Radcliffe's balanced response, adopted a more incisive tone. "Impressive how you can speak for 15 minutes without really answering anything," he began ironically. "All this sophisticated rhetoric doesn't change the fundamental fact. Your church asks us to believe in miracles and resurrections without any scientific evidence. How can an educated man in the 21st century seriously defend this?" The Dominican responded with the same calmness. "Your question touches on the core of the discussion, the relationship between different types of knowledge. Modern science, by its methodology, limits itself to studying regular, repeatable, and quantifiable phenomena. Unique historical events, whether religious or not, require another type of analysis." Dawkins interrupted, "Are you suggesting we should accept unverifiable accounts of supernatural events simply because they're ancient?" The moderator asked him to respect the response time. Father Radcliffe continued, "The value of historical testimony doesn't depend on the scientific knowledge of the witnesses, but on their credibility in reporting what they experience. Many non-Christian historians recognize that something extraordinary must have occurred to transform a group of disillusioned followers into people willing to die for their conviction." The Dominican then presented a perspective that surprised many. Doubt is not the enemy of authentic faith, but an integral part of it. Thomas, the apostle who doubted, is an important part of our tradition precisely because of this. In the next round, Father Radcliffe asked an unexpected question. "Professor Dawkins, in your books, you passionately defend values such as truth, justice, and compassion. If we live in a purely material universe, the product of blind and impersonal forces, what is the objective foundation for these moral values?" This role reversal visibly disconcerted Dawkins, who responded with increasing irritation. "We don't need supernatural myths to have morality. Empathy and cooperation evolve naturally in our species as social adaptations." As the debate progressed, the contrast between the two participants became increasingly clear. Dawkins, increasingly frustrated by the impossibility of destabilizing the Dominican, adopted a more aggressive approach, abandoning his initial academic tone. In the penultimate round, he decided to make a thinly veiled personal attack. "You speak so eloquently about morality and ethics. You defend yourself with rhetorical skill. But in the end, you represent an institution that historically persecuted scientists and covered up abuses. How do you reconcile this with your conscience?" Some in the audience showed visible discomfort with this change in tone. The moderator had to intervene. "Let's keep the focus on the debate of ideas." For the first time, Father Radcliffe showed a stronger emotion. Not anger, but a palpable sadness. His voice became softer. "This is the most painful and necessary question. The institutional and individual errors are an open wound. I wouldn't sleep peacefully if I didn't work daily to ensure such errors are not repeated and victims receive justice. These aren't just words, they are concrete commitments." The Dominican then spoke about the reforms implemented, advances in dialogue with science, and the constant need for self-criticism within the Catholic tradition without adopting a defensive posture. Dawkins, visibly annoyed by a response that offered no openings for new attacks, interrupted, "Pretty rhetoric doesn't erase historical crimes?" When the moment for the final question arrived, Father Radcliffe decided on a different approach. "Professor Dawkins, what personally motivates you in your crusade against religion? Is there any formative experience you'd like to share?" This personal question caught Dawkins completely off guard. Suddenly, it was he who needed to reveal something about himself, not just attack. That isn't relevant to the debate," he responded defensively. "We're discussing evidence and rationality, not personal motivations." In the final considerations, it was evident to everyone that the debate had taken an unexpected turn. Dawkins, clearly frustrated, abandoned any pretense of academic serenity. "I continue to be impressed by religion's ability to survive in the modern world," he began, his voice laden with irritation. "It's remarkable how well-articulated speeches can mask the fundamental absurdity of religious beliefs." Gesturing emphatically, he continued, "Today we heard many elegant words and philosophical distinctions that at their core are merely elaborate rationalizations to justify beliefs that don't withstand basic scientific scrutiny." Looking directly at Father Radcliffe, he concluded, "I respect your intelligence, but I regret that talents like yours are wasted defending the indefensible. Imagine what brilliant minds could accomplish if they weren't shackled to medieval dogmas." The moderator thanked him and passed the floor to the Dominican. Father Radcliffe adjusted his glasses and began calmly, "I sincerely thank you for this opportunity for dialogue. Even in profound disagreement, we can learn from each other." The theologian then offered a reflection on how different traditions of thought, religious and secular, have contributed to our understanding of reality. "The Catholic faith doesn't ask me to abandon reason, but to recognize both its possibilities and its limits. It doesn't ask me to ignore science, but to appreciate that there are dimensions of human experience, love, beauty, moral meaning, that transcend purely material analyses." He concluded with an observation that silenced the auditorium. "Perhaps true human progress lies not in abandoning religion or embracing it blindly, but in cultivating a society where different worldviews can coexist in respectful dialogue, without mutual demonization." At the end of his speech, a large part of the audience gave him a standing ovation, including academics who were clearly non-religious. Dawkins, visibly uncomfortable with the warm reception given to his opponent, rose abruptly. As the moderator announced the public question session, Dawkins whispered something to his assistant, gathered his belongings and headed for the side exit, without looking back. The moderator, surprised, tried to call to him, "Professor Dawkins, we still have the question session." The scientist's abrupt departure caused a murmur in the audience. Father Radcliffe, noticing the embarrassment, stood up and said kindly, "Perhaps our debate was more intense than we expected. I'm available to answer questions." For the next hour, the Dominican answered questions from believers and non-believers with the same attention and respect. A young biology student commented, "I'm not religious, but I was impressed by your capacity for dialogue and intellectual honesty." Weeks later, in an interview with an academic podcast, Dawkins was questioned about the debate. Visibly irritated by the mention, he responded only, "It was a waste of time. Some people simply aren't open to rational questioning." Father Radcliffe, for his part, never publicly commented on Dawkins's abrupt departure. When asked about the event, he would only say, "It was a valuable opportunity for dialogue. I hope it contributed to a deeper understanding of different perspectives." The debate, although ignored by the major media outlets, became a case study in several British universities on how discussions between science and religion can be conducted with intellectual depth, and how respect and integrity often impress more than provocations, even in the academic world.